wanted to take this opportunity to give you a little bit of a rundown on a project we finished probably 9 or 10 months ago now, working with the GBCA to look at the mid-tier sector across the Australian commercial office environment and get a sense as to why they haven't been, and I'll come to this, haven't been putting in place energy efficiency measures to the degree that we've seen from the premium and A-grade market. And we'll do a little bit of reflection in terms of what that means here for New Zealand, and particularly for the NABERS rating tool and its disclosures on energy efficiency. So the work that we did was a partnership between federal and state governments as well as the GBCA to try and look at this area. And it came at an interesting time. So we'd come off a realization with the INDC process leading up to the Paris Conference of Parties that we were going to head towards an inevitable move toward a 2-degree climate future. Fortunately, from my personal perspective, that's now looking much more likely to be a 1.5-degree aspiration, both here in New Zealand and in Australia. And there was a larger recognition from governments in Australia that a huge opportunity existed for us to meet at least a significant proportion of that target from the office market, given the contribution it makes to the demand for electricity services and therefore greenhouse gas emissions. Unlike New Zealand, with its enviable 80% renewables in the generation market, we are way behind. We are way behind in relation to that. In Australia, we are struggling to meet a 20% target by 2020. In fact, there'll need to be a fair amount of investment there over the next few years for us to meet that, even including hydro. So what did we seek to do? Well, we were effectively trying to understand from a market position perspective, well, what is the mid-tier market in Australia? What does it look like? Who are the main players? How many buildings are there, and where are they located? What's their current energy performance? And what are some of the barriers affecting the uptake of energy efficiency in that key sector? So what did we find? Well, we found that they were generally smaller in scale. They were older, often built before the year 2000, and they had older equipment as part of that. Sorry, I'll just make sure older equipment that formed part of their building fabric, so older HVAC systems, etc., with limited capital spending to improve those over time. We typically found tenants were less engaged in energy efficiency in those buildings, and these small to medium-sized organisations whose main imperative was renting a space was located in a good location close to where they carried out their business and was cost effective. So weren't driven necessarily by the same key directives as we saw from the premium market, which was around demonstrating the positive characteristics that you get from a higher star rated building. But is it significant? Well, this graph generally indicates, I think, that it is. Around 70% of the market in Australia is termed mid-tier, so the B through D grade properties. And when you have a marketplace where buildings contribute 23% of the greenhouse gas emissions of a country, 19% of which are coming from the commercial sector, then it actually does generate a reasonable opportunity for governments to try and intervene, and for people such as the GBCA and their partners here in New Zealand to see that as an opportunity to try and generate significant market change and efficiencies. Clearly, as I said, though, the greenhouse gas profile here is significantly different based on the electricity consumption market, but nonetheless important. So what is that opportunity, and is that real in relation to mid-tier? You might expect that the smaller end of the market are therefore smaller users of electricity. That isn't actually what we find. So when you look at this little graph over on the left-hand side, as you go up the net lettable area space, so smaller spaces tend to have higher energy intensity. So that is to say, the market that isn't currently being penetrated by the NABERS rating schemes, by energy efficiency opportunities, or the Green Star rating tools tend to be the worst performers. And we know, this is a classic climate change cost curve. We know that at the far left-hand side of the cost curve, in fact, delivering more in terms of carbon abatement costs back to the people who make those investments than their initial cost, energy efficiency rates pretty highly, long before you get to this side of the curve where it actually costs you money to abate greenhouse gas emissions. So we've got two things. We've got a marketplace which is ripe for investment, and we've got a large opportunity cost of not undertaking that work. So who are those owners of the mid-tier space? Well, we found that they were principally corporates, private owners, family, sometimes second and third generation family owners, foreign owners, corporations, strata titled, as we have in Australia, and smaller percentage of government owners. So around 20% of government leases are in the mid-tier space. And we really identified when we reached out to those stakeholders to talk to them that they were focused on financial returns, tenant retention, and keeping the buildings operating. Energy efficiency was generally lower down their agenda and generally lower down in terms of their understanding of what that means, and they didn't have engagement with their tenancies in relation to that. So what were the barriers? Well, some of the clear barriers, and those that we share not just with the mid-tier market but the premium as well, was access to capital. We know clearly that there is a landlord-tenant divide in relation to accessing capital, which derives a benefit principally for the people who don't pay that money. The landlord pays, the tenant gets the benefit. And if those tenants aren't looking at energy efficiency and they're primarily trying to keep their costs down and be located near to the place of work, then they're not willing to see a premium, and therefore it makes it difficult to access that capital. There was generally a lack of knowledge, though, and awareness around energy efficiency and the benefits, both financial and non. And I say that, of course, because the benefits outside of the reduced cost for operations of the building, and as we know from many of the new products that you can install to improve energy efficiency, the reduced upkeep or servicing requirements and costs. We do know, of course, that there are much bigger gains to be had from wellness and productivity within the tenants themselves. So those investments yield greater results than they do just from the energy savings. And yet there was a significant lack of understanding across the population of people that we spoke to, and we surveyed them pretty extensively. There was a perception that the energy efficiency investment won't actually yield a return, so there was skepticism actually around even spending that money, that it would actually provide the return which was sold to them. And there was skepticism around a marketplace which had been littered in Australia from things such as the energy efficiency opportunities and the state-based schemes which identified cash-based white certificates processes to incentivize the implementation of smaller scale energy efficient light bulbs, etc. That it was a bit of a Ponzi scheme, and therefore people were just trying to get rich and they weren't actually going to derive a benefit from in making that investment themselves, so a level of skepticism. As I said, the classic rule, and this is no different for the premium space than it is for the mid-tier, there is the split incentive between tenants and building owners, and they generally weren't aware of the opportunities that were available to them, such as the energy efficiency upgrade agreements that are in Australia, whereby councils play a tripartite role so that council rates go up to pay the costs that effectively the councils subsidise to put energy efficiency in place, so the tenant ultimately pays. There's a lack of motivation, a lack of tenant demand, disruption to existing tenants, so the concern that actually doing something means that you might have to disturb a tenant and you don't want to do that just for fear that they might leave, and short-term thinking from owners. We knew that a good proportion of these people would be focused on financial returns. What we didn't realise would be their sole directive, and so spending any money at all was seen as a negative outcome. I wanted to try and reflect a little bit on the NABERS scheme, which I know the New Zealand Green Building Council has ownership for here in New Zealand, to talk through a little bit of the results that we've seen over the years. Now, NABERS has been in place for a little while across New South Wales and now nationally across Australia. But what we've seen is that the disclosure requirements, particularly once mandated, have led to significant energy efficiency improvements. So the little graphs over on the left-hand side show the total size of market, so significant increase in market size between the first time that you rated and the second time, but actually an increase in star rating. So on average, just over a half-star rating increase from the first time those buildings were rated to the second time they had to be rated. So energy efficiency improvements were being put in place in between those first rating and second rating requirements. And as you might expect, between those first time rated buildings and the second or third time that they're rated, significant reductions in energy utilization per square meter. Now that's interesting, right? In the concept that NABERS is only a disclosure requirement. So it only actually requires those buildings to put a star rating on them to say this is our energy performance. It doesn't actually require them to make any investment whatsoever. But the implications and the impact of having that disclosure requirement was, for the premium grade market, that it became a competitive differentiator. Tenants became much more engaged in what that meant. There started to be communication between landlords and tenants in terms of star ratings, what it meant, productivity, wellness. People started to pay a premium and seek out higher performing buildings. And we've seen a general move in the population for that premium and A grade market. And you can see that over here. So this is the total percentage in terms of those entire rated populations over the years. And you can see that there's now a significant proportion that are between 5 and 6 star, whereas, but 5 years prior, or 3 years prior in this case, for the data that's available, that was much smaller. So an overall improvement in relation to energy efficiency in that marketplace. So we clearly identified there was a business case. The next stage was actually for the GBCA through its Green Cities seminar program, which is coming up, I think, in a few weeks' time. Last year, they then took this information and this analysis, and they took it to a group of 50 stakeholders from the property industry and said, so what do we do? What's the pathway for success? And those guys sat together and they came up with a strategic plan around how they actually work through government, through commerce, and through the associations to try and derive a significant benefit. And they identified these 6 mechanisms. The first was that there was still a lack of information and knowledge in this space, and so further research needed to be done to try and provide a robust evidence base, not just in relation to the barriers, but also the opportunity that could be achieved for this to be addressed more widely by government and incentivized. They wanted to build a compelling and quantified business case for energy efficiency upgrade. So really starting to communicate with those mid-tier office owners why they would undertake this, really trying to demonstrate why they would want to undertake the energy efficiency upgrades in the first place. Creating that awareness, of course, knowledge and behavioral change, and realizing that that needs to be a shift, not only in the people that they started to communicate with, because they are a different population of people to communicate with, but also because they are people who have not been subject to the same environment around sustainability practicalities. To develop and identify tools to promote improved energy efficiency performance. So again, in the premium market, and particularly with tools like NABERS, there was a general awareness between tenants and landlords in relation to what that means. In the mid-tier market, a deficit of that information, so they wanted to try and develop tools which would more appropriately access those people. And establish representative bodies and networks to again increase the communication and promote innovative financing mechanisms. So we know from Australia's financing mechanisms, some of the best have been those which have either given some level of accelerated depreciation, some tax treatment, or indeed capital outlay from governments to fund some of those initiatives, at least in part. So really, I just wanted to finish by touching on what that means essentially for the New Zealand market, and you guys are all much closer to that in proximity than I am, so I don't want to teach you to suck eggs. But I think there is a real opportunity here, particularly through the GBCA's, the New Zealand GBC's role in relation to the NABERS program, to identify a mechanism that will significantly transform the energy efficiency and performance of buildings across the nation. I'm happy to take questions.